Pizzeria Simulator was a game about tying up loose ends, but it's also given us one of the most controversial loose ends in the franchise through the Midnight Motorist minigame. From the identities of the characters to the purpose behind the set design, every part of this minigame has been the subject of endless debate, which has only been made more relevant by the release of the most recent Tales from the Pizzaplex book. So what's really going on with this minigame, and is it even possible to come up with a satisfying answer? Well, stay tuned and consider subscribing, because I'm going to go over just what I think is really going on in Midnight Motorist. To start, let's summarize what we know for sure about this minigame before we start trying to interpret things. In the beginning of the minigame, you start on a road surrounded by trees driving a purple car with rain pouring down. And if you continue down the road and turn off to the left side of the screen when not blocked by trees, there's a clearing with what looks to be a pile of dirt in the corner. Go on further down the road to the fork and go off the left side of the screen again, and you'll end up in a parking lot for a building labeled Juniors. Upon exiting the car, the player character is revealed to be a yellowish-orange character sprite, who I will be referring to as Mustard Man from here on out for the sake of convenience and alliteration. Upon talking to the green guy standing outside Juniors, Mustard Man is told, "Come on, you know you can't be here, don't make this more difficult than it has to be." With nothing left to do there, Mustard Man has to get back in the car, go back to the main road, and continue driving down until you eventually turn, leave the car in this empty space here, and walk up in front of a house. The camera zooms in as Mustard Man approaches the building, and upon entering, you can see a person wearing gray sitting on a couch or armchair watching TV. If you speak to them, they tell Mustard Man to leave him alone tonight, he had a rough day. Mustard Man decides to ignore this advice, and if you head up, you come to a door, presumably leading to the room belonging to him the gray guy mentioned. Mustard Man knocks on the door, but when there's no response, he says, "I told you not to close the door." If you try to leave after that, he'll say, "This is my house. He can't ignore me like that." And upon knocking again, he yells for him to open the door. When there's once again no response, Mustard Man decides to find a way in from the outside. Heading around the back of the house, there's a shattered window with a set of footsteps leading upwards and away from the window, and one pair of large three-toed footprints near the bushes facing the house. Seeing this, Mustard Man says, "Ran off to that place again. He'll be sorry when he gets back." And then the minigame ends. From just the surface level, it's pretty easy to see just how much there is to dissect in this minigame. But while there are a lot of variables to be aware of, they do tie together in a way where we can get a pretty solid idea of what's going on. With this in mind, I think one of the most important things to consider when theorizing about this minigame is the context that it was released in, since that gives us a good starting point for just how parts of the minigame should be analyzed. Like previously mentioned, most of Pizzeria Simulator is about tying up loose ends, which means that when we're considering Midnight Motorist, we need to be aware that as much as this thing did cause a ton of confusion, it was presumably meant to be solvable. Additionally, while each of the lore minigames is meant to explain or give context to one of the series' mysteries, there's another side to the minigames. They each represent a beginning for some character or event in the franchise. In the Security Puppet minigame, we see a more detailed version of the events that led to Charlie Emily, William's first victim according to her father Henry, possessing the puppet. In Fruity Maze, we see how William lured away Susie, the first victim of the Missing Children's Incident, or MCI. Even the Candy Cadet stories each explain the origins of certain events, characters, and their motivations, which I give an in-depth explanation of in one of my previous videos you'll find linked in the description. As such, it makes sense to me that Midnight Motorist was intended to clear up the beginnings of another major series event. But to figure out what exactly that event was and what the minigame is meant to clarify, there are a few things that need to be ironed out. First, when exactly this minigame takes place in regards to other series events. Second, who the characters we see in this minigame are so we know who's relevant. And third, how those characters connect to the places, objects, and surrounding context of the minigame to give an idea of the bigger picture. Fortunately, we're given a few clues that we can work with to get started. In the files for Midnight Motorist, the lore portion of the minigame is labeled Later That Night. The title Later That Night seems to imply that something specific happened earlier in the day, and whatever that event was important. So just what event is Midnight Motorist after? There are quite a few possibilities after all. There's the bites of 83 and 87, Elizabeth's death, the MCI, but the event that I think is most likely is Charlie's death. The fact that Scott Cawthon bothered to add rain in this minigame seems rather important when the one other minigame that includes rain is the minigame showing the night Charlie was killed and began possessing the puppet. In that minigame, the rain is what causes the puppet to collapse on Charlie's body. But in the events of Later That Night, the only purpose the rain seems to serve is background noise once you're out of the driving segments. The rain being included makes it seem as though it's important. So with the Later That Night labeling in the files, that would then give a reason for the rain. Of course, I'll say anything is possible, and it's good to be willing to consider alternative perspectives. But to me, this seems like a pretty clear connection. But if this is the case, why does it matter? That's where the characters come in. In Midnight Motorist, there are a few major characters, and boy are the identities of these characters hotly debated. Is the Mustard Man William Afton or the drunk father of a kidnapped kid? Is Michael Afton the TV watcher, or is he instead the runaway? Well, as of the recent Tales from the Pizzaplex book, we may have been given some clues thanks to the story Dittophobia. Dittophobia follows a boy named Rory who is quite literally experiencing the FNAF 4 nightmares in the FNAF 4 bedroom night after night, only for him to one day wake up, realize he's 10 years older than he thought he was, and find out that he's been subject to perception situation-altering fear gas experiments for the past 10 years that have been running automatically despite the place being abandoned. Leaving the rooms he was contained in, he finds himself in Circus Baby's entertainment and rental, where he stumbles across a motionless Ballora, and either Foxy's empty casing or Lolbit crumpled on the floor, based on how it's mentioned that the animatronic pirate fox had black eyes. Unfortunately for Rory's escape attempt, the elevator out of Circus Baby's doesn't work, and he heads to the office control room where he finds a two-way radio he uses to contact his childhood friend Wade's walkie-talkie. Wade tells him to try and find a generator to get the power on to activate the elevator, and that he might be able to find said generator in the rooms he was trapped in. Rory does find the generator, but right as he's about to touch it, the intercom turns on, and a man's voice tells Rory that he wanted to be there, and that he had ran away from home, didn't fit in at school, and that he was taken care of in the experiments in a way that he had never been outside of them, that this was his home and where he was safe and cared for. Rory is overcome by doubts, and when he reactivates the generator, the gas starts flowing again, and he's back to being trapped in the nightmare cycle. Meanwhile, the cassette that played the message rewound for the next time Rory would make an escape attempt. There's a lot of fascinating information we're given in this story, but one thing I want to specifically draw attention to is the detail that Rory supposedly ran away from home before being experimented on with the FNAF 4 nightmares. He was a runaway, just like the kid from Midnight Motorist. But I don't think this means that Rory is literally the Midnight Motorist runaway. I think Rory is meant to represent the true runaway, FNAF 4's crying child. Now before you click off the video or leave a comment about how the Tales books aren't parallels and it doesn't matter that the Tales books being game continuity would mean the Pizzaplex existed before FNAF 3 happened, just hear me out. We've known for a while that the crying child and the FNAF 4 nightmares are linked to the hidden areas of Sister Location. We can see areas of FNAF 4 on the breaker room map, and in the private room, if the code 1983 is punched into the keypad on the wall, the screens all change to views of the bedroom and the plush trap hallway from FNAF 4. On top of this, right beside the monitors is a Fredbear plush with what looks like a walkie-talkie, directly calling back to the Fredbear plush that spoke to the crying child throughout the FNAF 4 minigames, and potentially another connection to the whole Rory situation in Dittophobia. But why do I think all this means that Rory is meant to represent the crying child as the runaway and isn't literally the runaway himself? Well, other than the crying child being the one to have the Fredbear plush and Rory not being associated with it in any way, just as the voice tells Rory that his family didn't care about him, the Fredbear plush tells the crying child that he's hated. Just like the voice tells Rory he's safe and cared for in the experiments, the plush tells the crying child to not be scared because it's there with him. With the walkie-talkie holding plush being present in the Sister Location bunker where their experiments were being observed from, I don't think it's a stretch to say the speaker in Dittophobia and the speaker through the Fredbear plush are meant to be the same individual. What's more, thanks to the implications of the Sister Location bunker and the shared bright yellow text color used in both the FNAF 4 minigames and Fruity Maze in Pizzeria Simulator, we can infer that the speaker in all these instances is none other than William Afton. But you know who also speaks in a bright yellow text color? Mustard Man from Midnight Motorist, who just so happens to have a purple car of all colors, is driving around on what's presumably the night William got out of his car to kill Charlie, then drove away, and has a son who's run away from home who he threatens will be sorry when he gets back, perhaps implying an eventual punishment of subjection to the FNAF 4 nightmare experiments. However, this raises a different issue. We don't play as the crying child during the main nights of FNAF 4, but rather as his older brother Michael. In the survival logbook on a page about dreams, Mike draws a very detailed picture of one of the nightmare animatronics, which would be impossible if he hadn't seen them. On top of this, in the ambiance for the nights, there's altered audio from one of Phone Guy's calls from FNAF 1, which the crying child wouldn't have had any way to experience. So wouldn't Mike have had to be the one who was experimented on? Well, as it turns out, the new Tales book also gives us some answers on this front in another one of its stories, Alone Together. In this story, we're given a list of symptoms for being haunted by a spirit, including but not limited to having strange dreams and experiencing memories that aren't your own. If we apply that to Michael, it would perfectly explain how he would have seen the fear experiments without having actually experienced them. It's a sign of him being haunted by his younger brother, mixing with some of his own experiences from FNAF 1. Speaking of Mike, though, a common theory is he is actually the runaway. However, there are a few reasons why I disagree with that. For one, there are all the previously mentioned connections between Dittophobia, FNAF 4, and the runaway implication, but a major reason I think Mike's not the runaway is because he has connections to another character. From FNAF 4, we know Michael Afton speaks in and wears the color gray, and he's quite specifically shown in Sister Location to enjoy watching TV in his downtime, just like a certain individual in Midnight Motorist. Of course, there is one issue often raised when Mike being the TV watcher watcher is suggested, and that is that Mike in FNAF 4 is less than kind to his younger brother. This doesn't particularly mesh well with the same person who tells William to lay off the kid who, in this interpretation, would be his younger brother who he's shown to actively pick on. Why would he go from defending his brother from his dad to going out of his way to mess with the poor kid? The thing is, it's actually nowhere near as far-fetched as it seems. For one thing, I personally have seen a somewhat similar dynamic with my own younger brothers. They love each other, and I've seen them defend each other to our parents plenty of times when our parents were upset at one of them in a way that they considered unnecessary. However, the younger is more sensitive, which often rubs the older the wrong way whenever he gets emotional or acts in a way that the older considers immature. The dynamic between Michael and the crying child seems to me like a somewhat similar dynamic with this, particularly when you consider that the crying child likely didn't become a non-stop crying child until after the events of Midnight Motorist and the Nightmare experiments. We see in FNAF 4 that a big reason Mike tries to scare his brother is because he's a crybaby, and we also know from the final night cutscene that Mike cares about and regrets having hurt his brother. Not to mention, we don't see anything outside of these minigames where they might be totally fine around each other, so to stereotype Mike's character to just guy who bullies his brother is likely inaccurate. As such, given the couch person in Midnight Motorist has the same outfit color, text color, and hobbies as Michael, it stands to reason that this would be the case to indicate that this is in fact Michael Afton and to solidify that these characters are the members of the Afton family. From all this, we can also conclude that the event Midnight Motorist is meant to be explaining is the lead up to FNAF 4, and what happened with the crying child given his involvement and William's threat. But then, why would it matter that this minigame takes place the night of Charlie's death, and how does that all relate to the rest of the minigame? Well, I think it's because this minigame was meant to point to which characters died when, the origin of the shadow animatronics, and the true speaker in FNAF 4's final minigame. The death order for the characters in Five Nights at Freddy's has been a debated topic for quite some time, with a lot of contenders for who would have been first, with the main three debates being between Charlie Emily, Elizabeth Afton, and the crying child. In Pizzeria Simulator, Henry says he was the first one wounded by William's actions, but the concern often brought up in regards to this is that William Afton would need some motivation to kill Charlie, and that the death of one of his children would provide that, and not necessarily be attributable to William. Elizabeth wouldn't exactly work since she only died after William made the fun times to kidnap and kill kids for his remnant experiments, so for this reason the crying child is often suggested as being the first. However, if Midnight Motorist is the night of Charlie's death and the Runaway is the crying child, that would put Charlie's death before the crying child's, which actually makes sense given the context from the Silver Eyes trilogy. While the books take place in a different continuity, they are still, as stated by Scott, to be canon, which is a differentiation I go over in a previous video that will be linked below. And in that series, we're given more characterization for William than anywhere else in the series as of the date of recording, and that includes what seems to be his motivation for killing Charlie. It's mentioned that William had kept journals where he flip-flopped between near worship and extreme jealousy of his business partner Henry, and throughout the books he's constantly trying to be better than him. As Springtrap, he says that he's far more than Henry ever was, and he starts experimenting with Remnant to try and replicate the way Henry was able to create artificial life in the robot replicas he made of Charlie. Since in that continuity Elizabeth was killed by one of the Charlie bots William stole and was experimenting with, and the crying child is never implied to exist, it stands to reason that this jealousy of Henry is why William killed his daughter not only in the novel trilogy, but potentially in the games. However, I do think it's possible that this jealousy could have been partially related to family, and for that I go to the dirt pile. Most people suggest this is a grave, and I think that's quite likely. However, while some people have proposed this to be the crying child's, for obvious reasons I think a different candidate is more likely. I did think about it being Elizabeth since she doesn't make an appearance in the minigame, but this again brought me to the issue of her death not really being possible until after William Afton had a reason to make his murder robots. If you don't think Midnight Motorist is the night of Charlie's death, you could theoretically still make that work if you really wanted to, but the naming of the minigame and the reigns still feels intentional to me. With that in mind, I think a possible candidate for who this grave belongs to is the one other family member we don't see in this minigame, Mrs. Afton. It's always seemed a little strange that we haven't really seen any sign of Mrs. Afton in any of the games, and if we go off of the pretty major parallels between the character of Vanessa in Security Breach and Elizabeth Afton that I've discussed in previous videos, such as her dad's name Bill being a nickname for William, and Vanessa heavily implying that her dad said he'd always be watching and is compartmentalized in her mind, which we know is referring to Glitch Trap, amongst other things, we can potentially use Vanessa's therapy sessions to clue in what may have happened to Mrs. Afton. Even if you don't think Vanessa is literally Elizabeth, it definitely seems as though she's meant to connect to her in both appearance and backstory elements, so bear with me for a bit. In one of Vanessa's therapy sessions, we find out that her parents divorced, and that in the custody battle, her father Bill forced her to testify against her mother, and that something happened to her mom afterwards. I think it's possible from the phrasing of, "I know your mom," static cut after she lost the custody case, that she died. If all this is applied to Mrs. Afton, it could explain why there's a notable lack of parental supervision for the Afton siblings, the grave that couldn't really be any of the kids and potentially where part of William's bitterness towards Henry stemmed from. It's possible that William, seeing how Henry had mechanical skills and a perfect family he himself lacked, took it out on Charlie when he happened to notice that she was outside and alone. I'm not saying it's because of anything that may have happened with Mrs. Afton, since she probably divorced William for a very good reason given his weird jealousy worship journaling and the fact that he went to murder as a solution, but that whole situation could have been something additional to William's jealousy while simultaneously being a reason why we never see her. All this would put the death order for FNAF as possibly Mrs. Afton, Charlie, then either the crying child or Elizabeth. But why exactly would this matter to FNAF 4? Well, I think that has to do with the strange footprints outside the crying child's window, why and where he ran away, and the true speaker in the final FNAF 4 minigame. The first thought I had when seeing the large three-toed footprints was that it could be William or someone else in the spring Bonnie suit, since that would account for the size and shape of the prints. However, there are a few problems there. It would be a little weird for William to be upset about his kid running away from home if he was the one who made him run away from home, but also there's the fact that there are only 2 prints directly facing the house, which, when compared to the trail of child-sized footprints, is very strange. There are none further, and they don't go back in the opposite direction. Additionally, if the suit had been out in the rain, that would have triggered the spring locks, killing the person inside. It would be a similar situation for any other animatronic that could have been there, since, as we see with the puppet, they don't do well with water damage. But there are actually animatronics where it would make sense in the context of this minigame. The shadow animatronics. As supernatural entities, they wouldn't be bothered by the rain, and would be able to physically manifest and disappear at will, which could explain the noticeable footprints in the rain that have 3 toes, just like both shadow animatronics. On top of this, the shadows are shown to lead people to places in the series. The FNAF 3 minigames show Shadow Freddy leading the animatronics to the safe room where they're dismantled by William Afton. In the Fazbear Fright story You're the Band, a possessed kid climbs out his window and is led by a shadow to the Freddy's restaurant featured in the story. With this in mind, I think that whichever shadow this was did something similar, leading the crying child to something they thought needed to be seen, and I think what they led him to was Charlie Emily's body. In FNAF AR, Shadow Bonnie appears when obtaining Dark Remnant, and the dark coloration in the books is often used to connect to the substance agony. I think that the shadow animatronics could be entities that manifest from agony. With this in mind, I think that whichever shadow did this in Midnight Motorist led the crying child to the cause of their creation, the scene of Charlie Emily's death. In the minigame, Mustard Man says the kid ran off to that place again, which implies it's somewhere that the kid would have reason to try and go frequently. In FNAF 4, we see in the crying child's room that at one point he did like the animatronics, and could have been sneaking out to see them since we know that the restaurant was in walking distance from his house. If later that night does refer to Charlie's death, it would give there some purpose for him to be led there, as well as potentially explain why he's so scared of the animatronics, or why William would use the animatronics to scare him. After all, one of Scott's lore clues he gave for FNAF 4 was, what is seen in the shadows is easily misunderstood in the mind of a child. And if the crying child got there and found Charlie's body with the puppet animatronic collapsed on top of it, he could have misunderstood that as it being the animatronic that killed her, sparking his fear of the animatronics. William, then seeing this and wanting to keep suspicion off himself, encouraged this fear of animatronics through the nightmare experiments and the Fredbear plush. However, some people suggest that the Runaway was going to visit the grave. After all, the footprints are going up in that general direction, and the only other thing in that direction that we're aware of is Junior's, which most agree is a bar that William, or whoever they think Mustard Man is, would get drunk at and may have led to his behavior during and around the minigame to some degree. After all, the green guy telling him to leave could be a bouncer of some sort, not letting him in because he's known to cause trouble. The thing is, something about this explanation has always rubbed me the wrong way, specifically the name Junior's and why Scott would label it that. While I've seen it claimed that Junior's is a common bar name, so of course Scott would use it, I haven't been able to find any actual evidence of this when looking it up. Not to say there isn't a single bar named Junior's out there, but I couldn't find anything backing up the claim that it's a common enough name that Scott would label the building that just to make it clear it was a bar. However, if the name Junior's was more symbolic and not a literal name, it could instead be referring to Freddy's, which would be the junior location to the original Fredbear's Family Diner. The person outside, rather than being a bouncer then, could be warning William away from complicating an active disappearance or murder investigation depending on whether Charlie's body had been found in the back alley yet, which, as William would be a co-owner of the establishment, the green guy may assume William is aware of. Honestly, I have half a mind to say that unless William moved his family for the sake of proximity to the nightmare/eventually sister location bunker, the FNAF 4 restaurant could be a Freddy's given the Freddy's merch the kids have. How, if you account for how different minigames condense space differently, and sometimes in unrealistic ways, the general directions and travel path between the house and the restaurant matched the house in Junior's pretty well. We know there were spring lock suits at Freddy's locations thanks to phone guys saying they had them in his FNAF 3 recordings, and how Golden Freddy seems to show signs about the crying child and a kid who we know was murdered at Freddy's by William. Speaking of which, the whole possession situation is another thing I think this minigame ties into, if a bit more indirectly. In the scene after the crying child is bitten, he's in a void with all his plushies. Mike, as distinguished by the gray text, apologizes for what he did, and then the text color switches to yellow as the crying child is told, "You're broken. We are still your friends. Do you still believe that? I'm still here. I will put you back together." Given William is presumably the one speaking in yellow through the Fredbear plush throughout the game, most people assume that this means it's William talking through the plush here, wanting to put his son back together in some way after his accidental death. But I don't think that's the case. Not only would it be strange for him to use the term friend to describe his relationship with his son, but while the yellow throughout the rest of the minigames is a bright yellow similar to Mustard Man's and Midnight Motorist, in this minigame specifically, the color is consistently a faded light yellow. While text colors are shared in the FNAF 4 minigames, such as the green color, the same person never speaks in two distinct colors, and it just so happens that this light yellow is used in a different game with almost the same words, implying that this color selection is not an accident. At the end of FNAF World, in the ending you get after setting up all the minigames needed to get Happiest Day in FNAF 3, a pair of yellow eyes and light yellow text appears reading, "We are still your friends. Do you believe that? The pieces are in place for you. All you have to do is find them. Rest." This seems to directly parallel what was said to the crying child by the light yellow speaker, which implies that the crying child is the Golden Freddy spirit experiencing Happiest Day in FNAF 3's good ending. Additionally, I don't exactly see William Afton being the one to put any of the spirits to rest, and the fact that the light yellow is used in FNAF World the same way it is in FNAF 4 leads me to believe that it's a different speaker, more specifically, Charlie Emily. This is where Midnight Motorist comes into play. It can function as partial evidence that Charlie died before the crying child, as well as that there's some connection between her and the crying child to which a shadow animatronic would lead him specifically to find her body. Additionally, as Charlie's the one who gave life to the main animatronics after the missing children incident, it's possible that she did the same with the crying child and Golden Freddy, possibly because the bite caused Fredbear to be infused with some of the crying child's spirit, remnant, or agony, as he was physically put in a coma and eventually died in the hospital. Alternatively, spirits do have the capability to manifest outside their vessels, as shown by numerous instances in the books and in the FNAF 3 End of Night minigames, so it's possible she reached out to him in that way. In any case, I think the story here is that after Charlie's death, the crying child was led by a shadow animatronic that spawned from her death to her body. Seeing the puppet collapsed on top of her scared him into thinking it was the animatronic that killed her, and William, who was already upset about him running off to the restaurant repeatedly to see the animatronics, and not wanting any suspicion placed on him or for the crying child to be taken seriously if he did see anything too suspicious, encouraged and worked with his fear of animatronics to perform the nightmare experiments, possibly as the start of his studies of Remnant that likely started after noticing the physical and potential behavioral changes in the puppet after Charlie's death. Mike picked on his brother for being a crybaby, and eventually took things too far, putting him in the Fredbear animatronic's mouth, leading to his death and eventual revival by Charlie within Fredbear, which would eventually go on to become Golden Freddy. But that's just what I think, and it's absolutely valid if you think differently. But hey, if you're at all interested in my ideas, my next video is going to be a full FNAF timeline, featuring a special announcement for the channel, so make sure to subscribe for that. Please consider sharing with a friend or leaving a comment to let me know what you think. But as always, don't get stabbed and have a nice day.